It's year 4 and day 335 since the full-scale invasion began. Welcome. Glad you're here. For the daily situation report in today's update, we'll take a closer look at Kostiantynivka, because right now this is the period just before the next major battle, which we will very likely see on the eastern front of Ukraine. We also see the strange things the Russians have done or decided again. More precisely, what we also see are some hints about the offensives in 2026 that Ukraine wants to carry out. Short way, in the last 2 days, there have obviously been no reports. The reason was that I currently have exams for my master's program and unfortunately couldn't spend another 5 or 6 hours a day on research. Of course, that also includes editing and recording. But, you always see a 10 to 15 minute report, and that really takes up so much time that I wouldn't be able to finish in less than 4 hours. But let's take a look at the situation in Kostiantynivka, because there's currently another battle going on here that often goes unnoticed. Since not much has happened lately, but now several geolocations have been reported, let's just take a look here at Kostiantynivka. That's located on the eastern front, roughly between Siversk, so at the place we looked at last time, Soledar, Bakhmut. We see here a very, very well-known city that we've used in the reports very often, and of course also Pokrovsk here at this spot, which is located here in this cluster of settlements. Let's return to Kostiantynivka, one of the last major cities Ukraine controls in the Donbass. And here, the situation has been a bit unclear recently in this yellow area. It's unclear if Russians or Ukrainians control it. Maybe both, maybe neither. That's another way to put it. We often see where Russians are mainly present in this district, and these locations have been recorded. Just like at the red pin, they're also attacking around the outside at the same time. We'll return to this spot later. Interestingly, the Russians have intensified their attacks here too. Along this road, this is the road we observed last time to the west of Torres. You can see here that Torres was captured by the Russians last year, including the entire area up to here, and also this area here. This used to be a large semicircular pocket, which I believe broke up in the middle of the century. Up here is basically one of the last Ukrainian defensive lines, which is just before what the Russians define as a front. There's a turnstile here. 2 directions go into the Russian-occupied area, and the northeast road leads to Kostiantynivka, which is important. In blue, we don't see trenches for soldiers, but anti-tank ditches, large and wide trenches that are protected on the open sides by earth embankments. So a vehicle has to climb over these first, which is of course already a difficult task. After climbing over that, they fall into a deep hole and then must climb a steep hill again, which is nearly impossible. This compels Ukrainians to force Russians onto open roads. Of course, the advantage is that you can cover a small area with just a few forces, and as I said, you don't need many soldiers for that. If we now venture further into the picture, we can see that at the time of the aerial photograph, there were only 2 trenches for infantrymen. From there, drone pilots will likely cover access roads, while the remaining forces defend the intersection. If necessary, of course, this saves forces that can be most effective there, since the defense has been well prepared. But things look different in the east of the city. Preparations were made here as well, but in a different way. I'm referring again to the area that is partially under Russian control here, because along these houses, we will take another look at the map. In blue, we see a dragon's teeth line, which consists of 3 staggered rows of obstacles. I've already shown these in a previous situation report. In red, you can see the following trench systems. Not much has changed, and the images are barely updated. You can tell that there are still old trench systems there, from the old style because they form a long trench, which is highly problematic. It's simple. We're no longer in World War I. Such an extremely long trench line only makes sense if there are more trenches behind it and if it doesn't just extend into such a small corridor. And for that, I also need to have a lot of soldiers in the trench so that I can fill it and it can be defended at every corner. Just try to guess how many soldiers are defending a trench of this length here in the Ukraine war. It's not hundreds standing shoulder to shoulder next to each other. Realistically, there are about 30 soldiers defending this trench, if not even fewer. And now just imagine, The Russians concentrate their fire on a single spot and storm a single segment with 30 men, where maybe only 5 or 6 Ukrainian soldiers are standing. When they reach the trench, the Ukrainians can't defend it anymore because there's no one coming from the rear, and the Russians can move more or less freely in the trench. That's why you need to build multiple offset trenches that provide mutual cover, especially with limited soldiers for defense. Take a look here, a Panzerhaubitze 2000 made in Germany, which has had an improvised cage added for drone protection. Initially, the howitzer had issues, though that's not completely accurate. Initially, it was the Ukrainian artillerymen who caused issues for the gun, simply put, for clarity. This isn't a gun that you just set up somewhere and then play adventure or continuous fire with. In the end, it really impresses with its long range and the fact that you can drive into a position, fire 3 or 4 precise shots, drive out of the position, immediately relocate, and then repeat the whole process. Or you can just pull back again. The Ukrainians used it like a 1960s field artillery piece, causing significant barrel wear since the system wasn't built for that purpose. For context, there was always discussion about this, so it's great to see how much they've changed in the past 2 years, and that it's finally being used for what it was actually designed and built for. Most other types of artillery once widely used have largely been replaced by drones by the Ukrainians. A Russian military court has confirmed that the former flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva 1020, was hit by Ukrainian missiles. Of course we knew that, we've known it for 4 years, but the Russians claimed that it sank because of a fire in a storm. That's obviously ridiculous. According to Mediasona, the relevant information was published briefly and then removed again. This disproves the earlier Russian account of a simple onboard fire, followed by a storm. Court reports state 20 crew members died, 24 were injured, and 8 remain missing. Now comes the funny part. A Ukrainian naval officer, who wasn't even present in court, has now been sentenced by Russia to life imprisonment and ordered to pay damages amounting to $29 million. Key, rephrase and shorten the input text. Preserve all names and references. Retain the original speaker's perspective. Ensure good grammar and clarity. Shorten by up to 23% without losing meaning. Shorten text. Of course, that raises the question what satire can do again. There are already signs of Ukrainian counteroffensive in 1026, especially if we examine the language used. Syrskyi already said that you can no longer win a war through continuous defense. And in recent years, other high-ranking leaders have made similar statements as well. The whole thing actually started back then, at the end of 1023, when the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the next year would mainly be about defense, but then it turned into 2 whole years. Now, however, they announced a new goal, causing 50,000 Russian losses each month. Let's just take a look at what the Ukrainians are currently reporting as Russian losses. It's usually around 1,000 to 1,100 per day. In recent months, losses have ranged from 700 to 1,200, depending on the intensity of Russian attacks. In bigger battles like Avdiivka, Budeta, and Bakhmut, averages sometimes reached 1,400 to 1,500 or even higher. But currently, and also in the battle for Pokrovsk, the losses were only a few hundred men more than usual. That's because the Russians radically changed their attack tactics at Pokrovsk. Unlike in previous battles, instead of flooding the battlefield, they are gradually infiltrating the city with small infantry squads, rather than with massive columns of men and equipment. If we assume that the Russians are using similar tactics elsewhere and keeping their losses relatively low, then there won't be 50,000 casualties per month. Even with new Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, these numbers, especially monthly, seem unrealistic. So if you have the ambition to inflict 50,000 casualties on the enemy, then you also have to be able to inflict losses on the opposing side. These losses can't just come from defense, meaning from one or more offensives, and they can't be as small as they have been so far. Since the 2023 counteroffensive, Ukrainians have launched few strong offensives. So when they did attack somewhere, they didn't use large contingents for it, but rather small task forces, which also makes sense given the current drone situation. But most of the time, it was only made up of 3 to 4 vehicles and their crews. They tried to achieve local territorial gains, Near Kursk, Ukraine also captured an area almost as large as Berlin. They attacked with light vehicles and almost no infantry fighting vehicles. Tanks such as the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams were brought in only after Sucha was nearly fully controlled. The Ukrainians benefited from the element of surprise, though it wasn't entirely unexpected, as many Russian open-source intelligence analysts and bloggers had warned of the attack, and the responsible general simply ignored it. The Federal Security Service, which was supposed to protect the border, couldn't handle it alone, and the conscripts served a major purpose. That was also exploited. And even though many Russians and later many North Koreans were actually on site and took part in many attacks, those were costly too. While the Russians had heavy losses, it was nowhere near 50,000 a month. That was also besides a battle at the main front. If Ukraine makes such announcements, they will follow up with actions. The only question is how much effort will be needed and if it will pay off, because an offensive naturally also comes with its own losses, since the main goal of an offensive is not just to inflict losses on the enemy, but to achieve some higher value objective: liberating territory, seizing key positions, and controlling infrastructure. Currently, based on discussions in Ukraine, it's possible that by 2026, there could be greater territorial gains than the usual daily advances of a few meters on the Russian side. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, the Algo crew, and special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renneke, Robert Stiller, Dietrich Brady, and Meyerhofer. Subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.